a lot of people, Matt, have said that this is revealing of the fact that this election, for the Tories at least, is very much about containing reform, is about trying to make sure that they don't lose at least too many voters to the Reform Party, to their rights, that explains the hasty way in which the election was called, that explains some of the policies like national service that they're now looking to, that they've given up on trying to win the election. This is mainly about stemming the losses to their right as much as possible. Would you agree with that?
Well, the first thing to say is there's a deep hypocrisy in the Conservative Party's claim that they are using things like national service to defend British values, while simultaneously undermining British values, traditions and ways of life through this disastrous policy of mass immigration. I mean, that is those two things are completely incompatible. There is no serious integration strategy in this country. There is no serious long-term thinking about the population explosion that's about to happen over the next 10 to 15 years. The second thing to say is that's partly why the Reform vote is holding up. So if you look at the polling at the end of week 1, Reform's averaged 11%. What did they average before the election was called? 11.2%. It's basically not moved at all. That's also why Farage is now in the campaign in a much bigger way than we originally thought. You know, he's on Question Time, he's going down to Dover, he's giving these big speeches, he's zooming in, by the way, on only 3 issues: immigration, immigration, and immigration, right? Why is that? Well, I think it's because he's realized how completely woeful and weak our political class is. I think he was not going to run. I think Sunak did well to outflank him by calling the election. But I think in the 3 days that followed that, and I know because I've talked to him, I think he looked at Sunak, Starmer, I think he just looked at the landscape and thought, yeah, I'm going to have a go at this because they're all completely shit. I think that was basically what he thought. And so now Sunak's in this position of watching Farage claim ownership of illegal and legal migration as an issue, which, remember, is the third top issue for all voters and the top issue, the number one issue for all Conservative voters. Stopping the boats is the overriding priority of Reform voters as well. And he's got this massive football pitch to play with for the next 5 weeks because, you know, as we know, the two big parties have got this dreary consensus on being committed to mass legal immigration.
I'm glad you brought up Farage. I want to bring you in a second, Rakib, but because I wanted to play this clip, which came from earlier this week and kind of gifted us our first major sort of race row, I suppose, of the campaign at the behest of Farage and the interview on Sky News, which we're going to remind ourselves of now.
We have a growing number of young people in this country who do not subscribe to British values, in fact, loathe much of what we stand for.
Are we talking about Muslims here?
We are. And I'm afraid I found some of the recent surveys saying that 46% of British Muslims support Hamas, support a terrorist organisation.
So, Rakib, that clip has really done the rounds on social media, all the usual accusations from all the usual quarters of racism and so on and so forth. It is worth pointing out that that particular statistic that he was talking about there, this 46% of British Muslims expressing support for Hamas, comes from a Henry Jackson Society report. The poll in question has been argued over because the wording of it was, do you support Israel or do you support Hamas? Therefore, there's no pro-Palestine option. And while I'm by no means an expert, I do understand that the way you word a question can produce somewhat unrepresentative results. But are we in danger of ignoring the kind of, I guess, the question of Islamist extremism in this election by just dismissing it as something which only, you know, hotheads are interested in?
I think firstly, people saying that it's completely unacceptable for him to say that. It's perfectly acceptable because I think that ultimately we need to have a conversation about these very admittedly sensitive issues. I engaged directly, authored a piece for The Spectator where I said that I felt that Nigel Farage got it a little bit wrong. I think that some of the concerns he raises are perfectly legitimate, but I think that in terms of, I think there it came in as a bit of a grand sweeping generalisation. I think that there are some positive signs on the ground with British Muslim communities. And firstly, I hate the term British Muslim community because we're talking about an incredibly diverse population here. And there's no doubt at pro-Palestine demonstrations, we've talked about it before, the fact that anti-Semitism is relatively high within British Muslim communities, especially more segregated elements than the wider general public. And at those demonstrations, there's no doubt there's been the chanting of anti-Jewish slogans, there's been the displaying of pro-terror paraphernalia as well. But I think also the idea that you would completely ban all the protests, I do think that would be an assault on freedom of assembly and the right to protest as well. I think where the main issues have been is that our law and order institutions have not responded as effectively as they should when those kind of problems come about.